Let me introduce myself. I'm Vernon Nicolas. I'm the research director at Equilibrium Energy and Education in Chicago, Illinois. And we are a research-based wellness center that's dedicated to the study and practical application of energy-based therapies. And I'm actually joined here by my collaborator in this research, Bernadette Doran, who's in the audience with me. And she's also the founder and director of Equilibrium in Chicago. And we're here today to give you some of the results and findings of our research regarding some more about the energetic underpinnings about what happens when the Bengston Method occurs, and just gives you a more systematic understanding into the nature of healing and specifically what happens when we do Bill's image cycling. And before we begin, let me see. Forward.
Here we go again.
Okay. Can I just use
No,
the...
not a problem with the... No, it's not nothing wrong with what they're doing there. This just has to do with disconnecting and reconnecting the computer.
Great. Thank you, Tom. Okay, great.
Try again.
Okay. Well, before we begin, I wanted to thank a couple of folks. First, I wanted to thank Bill for introducing us to SSE and for inviting us to speak with you about our method. But also I wanted to thank Bernadette Doran, who's the founder and owner of Equilibrium. And she's one of the most talented visionaries and healers that I've ever met. And having seen all the positive transformations that she's made in other people's lives, it really inspired me to try and understand how energy healing works in a more systematic and defined way. And I wanted to, everyone is familiar with Bill's research. Many of us are familiar with Bill's research about his focus on saving the rodents from certain death from mammary cancer. And as you can see there on the left is an example of a mouse that he's injected with cancer, and what happened on the right of what happens to the mouse after they go through the Bengston treatment. And the way the Bengston treatment occurs, it's initiated by a process called image cycling. And image cycling is just the subjective means of initiating the flow of energy from the therapist to the individual or the mouse getting the healing. And a lot of the questions over the years have arisen, what is exactly happening when we go through the Bengston method and image cycling? What are the energetic underpinnings? And that's part of the reason why last year Bill decided to do a double-blind experiment where he actually laid in an MRI machine and he held a series of envelopes. Some of the envelopes actually had a blank index card. It had nothing in it. And some other envelopes actually had a hair sample from an animal with cancer. So the question was, when he held the envelope with the hair sample with cancer, did the brain respond autonomically to a stimulus that's in need of healing? And if you see no response, you'll really see no reaction to the brain in the fMRI scans. And that's the picture above there represents the control run, what you would typically see. But when Bill held the envelopes, he realized that although he himself was not able to subjectively tell what contained the hair sample versus what contained a blank index card, the brain certainly knew what was in each envelope, where you see an active frontal lobe energy activation when he held the envelope with the hair sample, and it turned off when he held the blank index card. So what did all this suggest? And it suggested, and it reinforced the notion that you don't really need an active belief or intention to heal to produce or trigger some response from the brain. Now, this isn't necessarily saying that a healing response is occurring when the brain fires, when the interior lobes start to fire. But what this does suggest is that the brain has an autonomic response, and there are other aspects that are going on that are working on the subconscious level that we don't necessarily have control over. And we've seen a lot of research focused on EEGs, MRIs, but what other ways have we looked at that help us determine, give us a more systematic understanding of the nature of energy healing? What other ways can we measure an autonomic response? And one of those ways is through a technology called gas discharge visualization. And gas discharge visualization, which I'll refer to as GDV, was developed by Dr. Konstantin Korotkov back in 1995. He's a Russian biophysicist professor. And it's all about getting the glow or the quantum light emissions of each of the fingers. So what happened? We have folks put their fingers on an electrode, and we send less than 1 milligauss of energy to excite the biophotons around each of the fingers, and that excites the biophotons around each of the fingers. And those biophotons, the emission is captured by the digital camera. And because it's captured by a digital camera, it allows us to do some quantitative analysis on the size of the energy glow. Now, Korotkov believes that we can really understand how we process and absorb energy through these scans of each of the fingertips. And Korotkov himself has done some independent research and looked at different sectors of different fingers, borrowing from the traditions of Eastern medicine, where each different part of the finger corresponds to different organ or a different system, and they've been verified through clinical trials. So if you look at the far right and you see a scan of the thumb, you can see how that bottom part of the thumb refers to the throat or the thyroid gland, and you see some missing emissions there. It shows that there's an underactivity of energy, a sort of diminished vitality of life force or energy that's in the throat or the thyroid. And the key to GDV is really understanding the number of pixels that appear in each sector. So the idea is that when you add the number of pixels across all the different sectors, across all the different fingers, what you can finally calculate is the size of the energy field for any one given individual. And that's the quantitative measure that we're going to be talking with you today. Now, this technology continues to be vetted, and it was approved by the Russian Ministry of Health following a series of clinical trials. So it's gone through a rigorous vetting process. And if you'd like to read more, there have been over 80 papers that have been summarized in a meta-analysis in the Journal of Alternative and Complementary Medicine. And you see other institutions and organizations who have really taken GDV and looked at it into a more detailed vetting process. Now, the reason we're focused on GDV is because it can help us understand whether there are any particular energy signature patterns. And so we wanted to find out through our envelope experiment, is there a specific energy signature to the Bengston method? Because that really helps add to the literature behind energy healing of a more systematic understanding of the nature of healing. And it can help us understand the energy that's involved in healing. But the second question we wanted to understand was whether these scans, just like the EEGs and the MRIs that we've seen in prior research, do those also reveal an autonomic response in the energy field? And if they do involve an autonomic response, what exactly happens? So when we conducted the envelope experiment, we had 9 participants involved, including myself. All of us were trained by Bill as he visited us in Chicago during an in-person weekend workshop last March, and one person actually was trained using his Sounds True CD program. And all the folks that came from a wide range of occupations. Some of us work in fast-paced corporate environments as part of our day jobs. Other folks are teachers or energy psychologists or energy workers or nurses. So we came from a wide range of backgrounds. And Ken had talked a little bit earlier today about the nature of resonant bonding. And all the folks that came in today, we had a varying level of familiarity with each other. We did not come in all friends, all acquaintances. Some of us did not know each other when we first started this experiment. So there was a varying degree of familiarity with everybody in the group. And we all volunteered to participate. So there may have been some potential self-selection bias. Now, when we got everybody in the same room to conduct the experiment, we instructed everybody, do not do image cycling. And so we wanted to avoid conscious cycling to make sure that effect was taken out. The intent of image cycling was removed from the ultimate scans. So as you can see there, we took a scan of everybody before holding an envelope. we had only one person hold one envelope at a time to avoid any interaction effects of multiple people holding multiple envelopes at the same time. And then we took another scan of an individual holding the envelope after about 10 minutes to see what the effect was. Now, the envelope content, instead of a hair sample of an individual with cancer, we had names of individuals who were undergoing Bengston treatments from Bernadette. Or they were blank index cards. So none of us knew what was in the envelope, and we actually had more envelopes than we had people to introduce a little bit of extra randomness in the experiment. So the hypothesis was that anybody who's holding an envelope, a sealed envelope with names in it of cancer patients, we should be able to observe some sort of autonomic Bengston Method energy response among those therapists. And we shouldn't see any kind of response among the folks who are holding a blank index card. But in order to make a lot of sense of the results, we have to first define what the Bengston energy signature looks like, because it could mean a whole lot of different things. And the nice advantage of working at a wellness center such as Equilibrium is that folks come to us and they ask us, can we have a Bengston treatment? And so we use that opportunity to get a pre-read and a post-read of what happens to them after each of those treatments, taking these GDV scans. And to make sense of the results, you have to look at 2 sets of finger scans for each individual. Now, the first set of scans, when people place their fingers on the electrodes, we don't use a plastic filter right on the electrode, and that enables us to capture the amount of sweat on our fingers. And because of that, it reflects the activity level of the sympathetic nervous system. And Korotkov claims that that allows us to understand the psycho-emotional constitution of the individual. Now, we take a second set of scans when we look at we put a polyethylene filter right on the electrode, and that prevents the sweat from being picked up by the GDV scan. And that reflects the activity level of the parasympathetic nervous system, which reflects the physical condition of the individual. And so what you'll see here in the next series of slides is just what happens to people's energy fields, both from a physical, which is the blue bar, and an emotional, which is the red bar. And what you see here is the pre versus post impact. So at 100, meaning no real change, you saw, on average, no real change to an individual's physical energy field after a Bengston treatment. But when you look at the emotional field, you saw about a 5% decrease in the emotional field on average. And it's not necessarily a hugely significant difference, but it's a consistent difference. The trend is there. We don't have the numbers for statistical significance, but the trend is certainly there. So the big question is this Bengston method going through the root cause? Is it penetrating to the root cause of disease, which often begins on an emotional level? Is that why it can heal a lot of diseases, such as cancer, or some of these really challenging diseases that aren't necessarily based on from a physical root cause? Now, we also wanted to look at what happens between a therapist and a recipient who conduct the Bengston method. And when we looked at therapists, you saw the same shrinkage in the emotional field and about the same stability in the physical energy field. And when you looked at the recipient, again, the same shrinkage in the emotional field of the recipient, but there was a little bit of expansion in the recipient's physical field. So they were definitely getting a benefit from the Bengston treatments. Now, the question that this produces is that we see the similarity between the therapist and the recipient. Does that mean that there's some sort of resonant bonding going on between a therapist and a recipient when a Bengston treatment occurs? Unanswered question. Now, what you'll see here is a series of slides. And on the x-axis is the size of the energy field before Bengston treatment, and on the y-axis, the size of the energy field after the treatment. And I'm really impressed by the strength of the predictability and the correlation between the pre and post in the emotional energy field. And you don't really see that in the physical energy field. That's a really sharp contrast in the predictability before and after. Now, because at Equilibrium, the Bengston method is one of our favorite methods of energy work, But we also have a couple other popular forms of energy work, including Reiki, which is another hands-on form of healing, and holographic memory resolution, which is a form of energy psychology. And when you look at those R-squared values, the strength of the predictability between the pre and post fields in those particular modalities, you don't see that same effect for Reiki and holographic memory resolution. And in fact, when you look at those two particular modalities, it's a little bit stronger for the physical field than it is for the emotional field. So you can see that the Bengston method has potentially what we call a unique energy signature. Is this enough data to say that there's a unique energy signature to the Bengston method? I don't know. It's one of the questions. But there certainly shows that there's a clear difference with the Bengston method versus other popular forms of energy healing. Now, we know that because different sectors of the finger correspond to different aspects of the body, what Karakov claims, you can also measure the size and the vitality of different chakras within the system. So the output, this is some of the output that you see from a typical GDV scan. And ignore right now the alignment of where the balls are, but the bigger the balls, the bigger the chakra size. And so that's what somebody looks like before coming in for Bengston treatment, and then that's what somebody would look like after they come in for treatment. Now, what is the denominator? What is the theme that you see? Shrinkage in the size of the chakras. And then that's what we tend to see in general, that the Bengston method tends to shrink the major energy centers after treatment. And so the possible explanation is that when the system becomes excited, an emission of energy tends to occur, but that causes the system to go to a lower state of energy, and that could be a cause of the shrinkage. And that's all driven by what happens in image cycling. So in image cycling, you're thinking about your most ardent desires, the wishes that you want most fulfilled, and sometimes it gets you excited. Now, when you look at across all the different 7 major energy centers, you see that shrinkage pretty consistent. So there's not one place in the body that's necessarily more active or more shrinking than another. And when we wanted to put this in the context, looking at Reiki and holographic memory resolution, the question is, do we see the same kind of shrinkage in those two modalities versus the Bengston method? And the answer is no. We actually see more expansion in the chakras with Reiki and more expansion with holographic memory resolution. So this is another data point to suggest that there could be a unique energy signature to the Bengston method. So that leads us, now that we're grounded on what the potential unique energy signature is from a Bengston method, that gives us the opportunity to understand the envelope experiment results. So we know, just to recap, we see shrinkage in the emotional energy fields, we see no huge change in the physical energy fields, and we see shrinkage overall from most of the chakras. And you can see there's more shrinkage when people who held the names. You can see in the people with no names, there's a pretty similar response among people with and without names in the envelope. You can see that the correlation is still pretty strong before and after, and even people with versus without an envelope. And the physical energy field still doesn't exhibit any kind of relationship. When you look at the change in the chakra size, you can see that the people with the names actually had a slightly greater energetic response than the people without the names, but they still looked like there was a Bengston signature going on. And when you looked at the excitement levels of the people with names and without names increased to a similar degree. So again, that suggests that there's some resonant bonding going on. Now, when we asked people if they felt like they had a name in their envelope, people were not correct in their subjective interpretation. So it just goes to Bill's point that he's made several times before, that more objective data behind energy healing is needed, and that so much in energy work is assumed. And objective data is really needed when trying to understand the impact of energy healing. Now, we also looked at the different variation of the envelope experiment because of the fact that we had so many participants. Did those group effects, did resonant bonding affect our results in any way? Well, this time we only had Bernadette participate, and we had her go through the same instructions as we shared with the group. Now, this was her baseline read on the far left. And unbeknownst to us, we had names in the first 3 envelopes. So after 5 minutes, her energy field shrank just a little bit. After 10 minutes, it continued to shrink. After 15 minutes, it shrank even more. And when, in the last envelope where there was no name, we saw a restoration in her emotional energy field. So the GDV scan was picking up an autonomic response. Did we see that same impact in the physical energy field? Yes, but not to the same extent. And we saw the same shrinkage in chakra size, and even more pronounced than what we saw earlier. So the key takeaways was that there's a predictable, consistent, and measurable effect on an individual's energy field for somebody going through the Bengston treatment. And it really appears that there's a unique energy profile or signature. Now, the treatment definitely appears to produce a more excited state in the autonomic, in the sympathetic nervous system. And it really appears more in the emotional versus the physical energy field. Now, with GDV, we only focused on one of the major metrics. There's a lot more metrics behind the GDV output related to organ vitality that really could help us better understand what the energetic underpinnings from an organ and an anatomic standpoint would be. Now, some of the questions was, by telling people not to image cycle, did that produce the effect, the opposite effect of people cycling subconsciously? And perhaps that was the case. But that really gives us an indication of what's our inability or ability to turn on or off the Bengston energy. And the autonomic responses to the stimulus, they're definitely recognized by the GDV scans. And it proves that reactions can occur to anybody trained in the Bengston method, and just not by Bill himself. So it doesn't speak to whether healing can necessarily be taught, because none of our scans were taken before learning the Bengston method, but just shows that the impact can occur among people who are not Bill. And it proves that subjective assessments, again, are just unreliable. We need more objective pieces of data, and that resonant bonding effects are really alive and well. Bernadette was the key in both experiments. If she did not participate in both the first and second envelope experiment, how would that have changed results? And how would have the results differed if we had patients who Bernadette had not known and we got those names from a doctor we had never been in contact with? Those are some questions that are still left unanswered. And so some of the broader implications is that why is the effect happening in the emotional field rather than the physical energy field? So does that suggest that healing happens not in the body but in the quantum energy field? And what's the role of excitement in healing? For example, in energy and emotion. And Ken had talked about this a little bit earlier. When you have ritual, you don't get excited anymore. And when you have ritual, that may diminish the impact of healing. And lastly, how can GDV be used to supplement future energy work research? Because GDV scans, we just touched upon a little bit of the major summary measures, but you can understand the vitality levels of the different organs based on different energy modalities. So we have a lot of questions left unanswered, but hopefully it gave us some food for thought as we head to lunch. And I really appreciate your time. Thank you for your question. Thank you.
We only have time for maybe 2 questions at best. So if we have a couple people who have a question, and here comes one right now.
So I assume that you're measuring area?
Correct. That's
okay.
Correct.
Because the GDV has probably 50 different parameters you could have measured, and I assume there are no changes in the other parameters. And the largest changes were in the area. So my question is that since you're observing a decrease in the energy emissions from a healer, basically, without the filter, how does this data compare with all the other experiments that have been done with Kerlian photography, which is basically the same as GDV, without the filter? Of course, all old Kerlian data never used filters. So, and there's a lot of studies which have shown that healers emit more energy when they heal. Now you're telling us that this healer emits less energy when he heals. That doesn't seem to jive.
Well, I think the clarification is that when you see a lower number, it means there's more sweat on the fingertips.
No, it means that's an interpretation. I'm talking about the raw data. You're measuring whatever Curlian measures, whether it's sympathetic, who God knows. Photons, I don't think it's measuring photon, but whatever it measures, you're getting a decrease. And all other studies like this in the past have shown an increase with Curlian.
It could
So
be, it could be something unique to the system.
Or is it unique to Bill? And have you actually done, Bill gets the same thing as the students? A decrease?
Well, I haven't taken enough scans of Bill
Of
to
Bill
come up with a
himself.
conclusion
Okay.
on
Okay.
that.
Okay,
But
just
it-
something to think about. Thank you.
It's a good question. Thank you.